All right, guys, let's go over prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. So at this point, what you have done is you have completed your mobiles and you have actually done this walkabout or that gallery walk out in the hallway. And one of the things that you saw out there was a picture of this. And so if you don't really recall what you did out there, just go ahead and make some observations real quick on this image that you see right here. And what you should notice are a couple of things. One, you might notice these dots on these eukaryotic cells. Okay, you also might notice the size difference between these two cells. So the eukaryotic cells, if you just look at these boxes or what look like boxes, appear to be much larger than these smaller little cells that are over here in the prokaryotic cells. And that makes sense because one of the things that we know about prokaryotic and eukaryotic is that prokaryotic are smaller while eukaryotic are larger, but also that little dot that we pointed out is what we would consider to be a nucleus. So a eukaryotic cell contains a nucleus, prokaryotic cells do not. Just for information purposes, what is the nucleus? It's a term that we've thrown out there a little bit, but a nucleus is an organelle or something that is within the cell. Just like your body has organs, cells have organelles, and it is a large organelle that contains the cell's genetic information. Okay, so that's all the instructions for the cell to do whatever it is that it needs to do. All those instructions, those recipes, they are included within the nucleus. So it's a super important organelle. Now, one of the things that I also want to point out here is the name prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and this is where the nucleus kind of comes back in. Prokaryotic simply means before the nucleus. So these are cells that evolved before the nucleus showed up, whereas eukaryotic cell means true nucleus, meaning it has a nucleus. So anytime you're thinking eukaryotic cell, you better be able to see a nucleus within that eukaryotic cell. Right, now here's another one of those pictures. So I just want you again, take a look at some of the observations. And one of the things that you might notice is that prokaryotic cells, these ones on the left versus the eukaryotic cell on the right, a prokaryotic cell is very simple. Whereas a eukaryotic cell has all these different complex organelles, like a Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, chromosomes, it's got the nucleus, it's got lysosomes, mitochondria, all sorts of these different things going on. Whereas a prokaryotic cell is just way more simple. It still has some things in it, but nowhere near as many. It's just way more of a simple cell. And so that makes sense that our prokaryotic cell would be classified by or be characterized by having simple parts, whereas eukaryotic cells are more complex. Okay, here's another example of something you may have seen out in the hallway. We've got onion cells on the left, which we've seen this before, and we've got cheek cells on the right. What are some things that you would observe? And I want to point out here, there's a couple of things. Number one, you've got some different parts that you might see between what we can now establish as plant cells being the onions and animal cells being the cheek cells. Okay, the animal cells come from you. You are technically an animal, therefore you are made up of animal cells. Now, both of these are eukaryotic. Okay, they both have nucleuses. We can see them, nuclei, right there, those dots in the middle. That is one thing that they both have in common, right? And if we go over here to this graphic, we can see in the middle, we've got a nucleus for both of them. However, the one thing that is very different is while there's clearly differences between the multiple cells over here, look at how clearly defined the border is here. What this is showing us is that plant cells have a unique cell structure that we can see over here at the very bottom left-hand corner of this page called a cell wall. Now that cell wall is unique to plant cells. So if you ever see a cell wall, you know that you're talking about a eukaryotic plant cell. This last image that you may have seen out in the hallway is a timeline showing the evolution of cells all the way from 4.6 billion years ago, where Earth kind of finally forms, and then how life starts to slowly progress until we get up to humans 40,000 years ago. Okay. Now I want you to kind of follow this timeline. The first thing that you would run into, interestingly enough, is prokaryotic cells 3 billion years ago. As you continue along the path, things get a little bit more complex. We start running into oxygen, and then we run into eukaryotic cells before they continue to get more and more complex into some of our modern animals. Now, what does this tell us? Is that prokaryotic cells evolved first. They were the first ones here. So when we're talking about things that are more than 1.5 billion years ago, we're talking about prokaryotic cells, because eukaryotic cells, the more complex cells, as we've said multiple times, didn't show up until 1.5 billion years ago. Okay. Now, the last thing in here that I really want to focus on is kingdoms. This was kind of mentioned after we go ahead. What we do is we take domains of living things. So I want you to take a look at this graphic. And we take all living things and we're going to split them into two categories, one being prokaryotic, the other one being eukaryotic. Now, the kingdoms come in when we start to talk about this next level down here, where we start to organize those even further. And so eukaryotics get split into animals, plants, fungus, and protists, things like an amoeba, whereas prokaryotic gets split into bacteria and one that's not mentioned here called an archaea that we see on this one. That's what gives this lake a really, really colorful color. Okay, but we can see that these are split just further. It's one more level of classification. That's all. Okay. And so if we kind of take these two things, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and we compare and contrast them, we put them together, here's kind of the summary of things that we get. Prokaryotic cells are very simple. They are usually unicellular. They don't have a nucleus. They're small, like we saw in that first picture. They evolved a long time ago, and we can see them in the categories of bacteria and archaea. Whereas eukaryotic are kind of the opposite. They're generally multicellular, though they don't have to be. An example would be an amoeba that is also unicellular, but they're more complex. They absolutely have a nucleus. They are larger organisms, and they evolved later, and they would be things like plants, animals, fungus, and protists. But there are a couple of things that these cells have in common. One would be genetic material, right? So even though this one has the nucleus, the eukaryotic cell has the nucleus, and the prokaryotic cell doesn't have a nucleus, they both still have genetic material, or what we would sometimes call DNA or RNA in the case of the prokaryotic cells. They also have this thing called a cell membrane, which is something, it's another organelle that just allows certain things to move in and out of the cell. All cells need to allow things in and out of it. And so all cells have to contain that cell membrane. Okay. All right, guys, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this was just a little nice review. If you're confused on this at all, make sure you just review it. Go back to the pictures and really try to focus on some of the pictures, the differences that you see between prokaryotic and eukaryotic. I think that's really helpful. And then this page right here is a really nice summary to help you kind of compare the two different cells. Okay? All right, let me know if you need any help. Otherwise, study up and let's get ready for this test.